Real quick sound test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, everything looks good. Once more, one more sound check. One, 5, 4, 7, 12, 11, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Alright then, welcome everyone. Welcome back to my channel. You might be curious as to why I'm back into 14 again here for this particular video, and that would be, of course, to address one more last thing before, I'm officially not supporting, 14 as a content creator anymore. So, in the last discussion video, if you were there to watch, or if you watched it at some point in time or you plan to watch it from this video, then I gave my last thoughts and opinions on what I believe is kind of, in a way, putting 14 in a bit of a rut for existing players and players who've been with the game for a long time and supported it. And I gave justifications and reasons for that, and why I'm feeling like I have to finally say enough is enough and just finally decide to give up and go on my way. But I did mention in the same video that I would like to speak to newer players in particular, so that they can sort of get a similar idea and maybe form their own opinion of what they think 14 is, should be, or just gain some context on what the game as a whole represents and stands for. And so, with that in mind, I kind of want to help you, if you're a newer player here, understand a little bit about 14 perhaps better, and understand like why I feel the need to kind of step back and away from it, and also why I also encourage um, you guys as newer players to keep going on through the whole game right up to the end, which, again, if we're speaking as end as a sort of, I don't know, concept here, then 14's and Walker expansion is essentially an end of sorts, but it's not like the game is like gonna shut down or anything to that effect. They have full intentions to keep this game going for as long as they possibly can until either they can't support it anymore, or like something were to happen to like the company or whatever, and that happens to the company a lot, unfortunately. um, they started off as, like Squaresoft or whatever, and then the Enix part came in when the other company merged with Squaresoft and decided to continue on the company's legacy, I guess you could say. And that's how we got to 14, is because of this sort of merging. But even then, with the Square Enix coming into play, they had other issues as well. They've had to go through a few bankruptcies as a company, which is never a good thing and never a pleasant thing. I've gone through a bankruptcy myself, and it's really not great at all. But they went through a bankruptcy, and then they invested tons and tons of money into Final Fantasy XIV, expecting this game to succeed and be like their big seller, their winner, and to help them essentially come out of the debt that they incurred and get things rolling back on track, essentially. Make up for lost finances and whatnot. And that's just one of the tales I'd like to explain to you guys here, you new players, is explain to you exactly how 14 began, how it all started, and give you that background knowledge so that you know exactly what you're getting into when you come into Final Fantasy XIV. But before we can talk about 14 and specifically, I think it's appropriate that we discuss Final Fantasy itself and what Final Fantasy represents. Because if you don't understand Final Fantasy, then you're going to be a little bit confused, lost, and not sure what to think about what Final Fantasy XIV is. And so by going back here to the beginning with this story I'm going to tell, you'll get a better understanding and hopefully be able to formulate something of a rational thought, and comprehension, if you will, of what Final Fantasy XIV stands for. Okay, so without further ado, let's sort of begin. So, Final Fantasy was initially started like way back in like, early 90s, late 80s, back in the sort of retro age of gaming where we had the old fashioned arcade style games, and then the like Sega's, the home consoles, old home consoles, and that's when Squaresoft, not Square Enix, don't be confused seeing the two here, but Squaresoft, the original company that founded games like Final Fantasy, etc. They were running into quite a bit of problems, and they weren't able to contract new workers and more games to be able to continue making more games, and they were just losing money. And so they were making one last game, investing what little bit they had left into one last game, to which, ironically, the person behind that game responsible for it decided that they'll call it Final Fantasy, because to them, that basically was it for them. They feared that it would be like their last game ever to make. So that's why they called it Final Fantasy. Because it's just one little Final Fantasy that they had. So they began working through all the technical stuff and testing, making sure the coding works, make sure that the game is playable and all that sort of fun information. And then they pushed it out and hoped for the best. Really. They hoped for the best that this game would succeed and that maybe it would help them bring them back from the brink. And to their shock and amazement, people actually did like it. They liked it a whole lot. It was an RPG, the first of its kind, really. I mean, there were others out there like Legend of Zelda and, others. But this particular one, it was special. And it brought in some bold ideas that have never been tried in RPGs before. And so a lot of people picked up the game and they absolutely loved it and adored it. And they played and replayed it a lot. They passed it on to their children. And then their children passed it to their kids. And they passed it around to their friends and all that. And it just worked. It worked out for Squaresoft there, so they decided, you know what, this actually really worked, and they contact the guy. They said, can you, the developer, I should say, sorry, they contacted him and they said, can you make more of these, the people, they're asking if there's a sequel, will there be more? And he was like, oh, well, I guess I can if that's what the fans want. And so they did that. They came out with Final Fantasy II and see how that came about and well. And then later they introduced, Final Fantasy III. It was also pretty liked by a lot of people. and 3 was one of the ones that a lot of people played first and everything before they played 1 or 2. So they really enjoyed that. And then comes along 4, which is definitely more less kind of the same, but a little bit more different. Like, they have decided to try new things, and that's normal for game developers to do. They will try new things. And I believe at the same time, 4 was under the development of another director at the time. So they were trying out some ideas there. And then, of course, comes number 5. This one, decided to add like more playable jobs, introduce like a chocobo sort of mechanic thing, and just played around with it a little bit and then gave it in the hands of players to try out and have fun with. And then comes 6, which is well praised and well accepted by many of the Final Fantasy players, and anyone who's ever heard of Final Fantasy. They always go back to 6 as one of the best classics games because it had an amazing story, well written characters. Gameplay was pretty unique and fun. It adhered to the Final Fantasy genre as usual, introducing like plenty of lovable and wacky characters on the side as well, and just sort of really sunk people in time investment wise. So Final Fantasy VI was one of those titles that people really, really praise a lot from that generation of Final Fantasy. And then we start coming into the newer ages, late 90s games and stuff, and that's when we get Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, where they're more 3D oriented and built for, higher performing machinery and such, like the PlayStation 1, which I believe, excuse me there for a minute, I believe was the only console that they could make it feasibly work for, because they put so much stuff into the games. Like, I'm not even kidding. They had to separate stuff into multiple discs. And if you grew up in the 90s like me, for example, you know those good old times, those good old days, having the multiple discs of Final Fantasy. That, you'd finish one disc and you're like, okay, well, now I gotta move on to the next disc. Okay, that disc's done. Now we're on to the last disc, or maybe there's a fourth disc. Okay, and so yeah, they put so much into those 3 games, 7, 8, and 9. There's just so much stuff all packed into it, and it still adhered to the classic Final Fantasy genre and theme. And you'll ask yourself, like, well, what exactly is he talking about when he means like classic Final Fantasy genre and themes? And that's where I want to kind of bring this in as it relates to Final Fantasy XIV, and that's certain things that have been repeated constantly throughout Final Fantasy's history as a game series, and that's things like Moogles, those furry little creatures that float with tiny wings. They have usually button noses. They have these big little round circular palms on their head, they call them. And they're just kind of like either cute or obnoxious. It really depends on the game, but people love them. Then we have like reoccurring enemies such as Gilgamesh from number 5. He frequently pops out in and around different games and always declares, "I am the strongest swordsman." And he says, "Give me your weapons," or he says, "Challenge me or I will take your weapons by force," etc. Usually followed by his bots, because he's usually trying to find his way back so he can face his destined rival, according to him. And then there's chocobos. Chocobos are fluffy, feathery companions that we typically will be able to use as mounts and ride around with, or sometimes like in 11 and 14. Sorry about that. Like 11 and 14, you'll have the chocobos function even more than just like a mount to get from place to place, but they'll also be kind of this companion that will help fight alongside you, and that's pretty fun. Pretty fun and unique. I definitely cherish my chocobo a lot. And then, other than that, there's like reoccurring bosses, reoccurring weapon types or names. Like some weapons will have names that I've taken from other iterations of the game's history. Typically, Final Fantasies will have really strong narrative-driven stories. They'll follow a very strict story path, and like it'll have all the kinds of different RPG elements. Like in most of the Final Fantasy games, you'll have turn-based combat where you'll configure like what each party member is going to do, then they'll execute the action. Then after that action, it will be enemies action turn next. They'll do theirs, and then they'll jump to the next person or next phase or whatever, and it will just kind of rotate around in different various ways on turn-based sort of styled RPG combat. Until, we get to other newer Final Fantasy games, that's when they begin to shift just a little bit slightly. When they get into like Final Fantasy 11 and 12, 13, 14, and 15. That's when we start getting more like action sort of based combat instead of the usual turn-based combat that most earlier Final Fantasies were akin to. But it's just something that game companies will typically do. They'll try to stay on with the trends as they become more popular, more adapted. And so that's kind of what Final Fantasy does, is they adapt with the times and kind of work to see like what's works with most other games. What do players love doing most in current day games that we have, and what they can possibly incorporate without copying, of course. You know, they don't want to completely copy everything down to the very letter, because then it's not going to be a unique experience for the person playing the game. They're just going to be like, oh, great. You know, it's just another typical RPG. Oh, okay, a dungeon. Oh, okay, a fetch quest. Oh, gee. Oh, how fun that is. So, they usually try to consider, you know, at least what's been done before and what they can maybe tweak a bit or, you know, adjust in a manner that would make it more acceptable and more, you know, player friendly. Or, sorry, not player friendly, but more replayable and more playable in a way, if that makes sense. But other than that, as we get into Final Fantasy XIV now, this project was in the works for some time after, you know, 11 and Final Fantasy 12 kind of hit off running at the shelves, and people love those particular Final Fantasies. That's when they began considering. And this is years after, you know, Final Fantasy 11 was already in service, because for a longest time Final Fantasy 11 was Squaresoft's Final Fantasy MMO, its top MMO, and in some ways it still is even today. A lot of fans feel nostalgia for it, and they just love to jump back in every now and then just to relive the experience and maybe enjoy something that they did before and that they maybe don't have now. So, for as long as 11's been around in service, that's when they started considering, well, you know what, we succeeded in making this game memorable and making it widely accepted and widely popular amongst fans. So why don't we sort of think about making another one that's more with the times, like I said, like I was saying just a few minutes ago, like how they adapt with the times. They were considering 14 to be something more attuned to with the common MMOs, and so with that in mind, they began to get into the process of designing and conceptualizing what 14 would be, what it would be like, and just kind of like how it should like function and in a way operate, so that they'd have something for, you know, players to really, you know, look forward to and be happy to play. And so that's what they did with designing Final Fantasy XIV, the original Final Fantasy XIV. Mind you, we're not quite yet at Final Fantasy XIV now. I want to make sure that we talk about It's beginnings of what happened with Final Fantasy XIV, the beginning before we got to where we are now, because that's also very, very important that we discuss. I apologize there. I'm just sort of checking things here. I apologize there. I'm just. Alright, everything looks good. Relatively, anyway. I just want to make sure that the sound is still up and going. But anyway, sorry for the little interruption there, but let's get into 14's beginning. So here we go. The Final Fantasy XIV team finally has something marketable to put out there, and I decide, okay, here's a core idea. Let's give it to the hands of players now to sort of test and give us sort of an idea like what direction this game's going in and how it should continue to go going forward. And so they did. They pushed out Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 or Final Fantasy XIV Online. It was a little bit clinky and clunky at first. Wasn't very perfect, but no game ever really is when it's first introduced. It takes a little bit of time to sort of warm up to and sort of get a real feel for before you can definitively say, like, oh yeah, you know what? This is not such a bad game. And so, Final Fantasy players, in specifically, and when I'm talking about Final Fantasy players, like I said, I'm not referring to like all the players that jumped on all the way from like World of Warcraft or Terra or Guild Wars 2 or Guild Wars or whatever games. I'm talking about specifically the targeted demographic, which is the Final Fantasy players themselves. And these are players that were still at the time even playing Final Fantasy XI, or they had taken a break from Final Fantasy XI, you know, and just went off to other series or other titles. But Final Fantasy XIV was originally designed for that target demographic of players who enjoy and keep up with Final Fantasy games as a franchise, as a series. And so they hooked that audience. A lot of them came over and tried 1.0 Final Fantasy XIV Online. I myself got to try a little bit of it whenever I would visit a friend of mine who owned a copy of the game. He would occasionally say, hey, here, you know, try this game out. You know, you like Final Fantasy stuff, right? And I'm like, well, yeah, you know, I kind of played it a lot in my younger years. It was childhood for me. And they're like, okay, well, here you go, make a character. And I'm like, wow, really? You're going to allow me to make a character on your account? Is that okay? And he's like, yeah, no problem. So I did that. Made an avatar. If I can remember right, I think I chose Monk to start, although they didn't call it Monk, they called it Pugilist or Pugilist, however you'd like to say or pronounce that. And so I played Pugilist around in 1.0 for a bit. Story was okay. I mean, I wasn't really a big fan of the whole texturing things. I definitely prefer the voice over stuff more than having to follow along a line and just kind of make up voices as I go. But you know, it wouldn't be an RPG, which stands for role playing game, if it didn't have some player imagination involved in it. So there you go with that. And so they went with that. But Final Fantasy XIV Online's beginning wasn't as perfect. Like I was saying, no game ever is perfect to start off. It takes time. And so Final Fantasy XIV Online had a bit of issues. And part of that was that as an MMO, you know, people of the current time when 14 was pushed out expected there to be sorry, I had something stuck in my throat. But people of Final Fantasy 14, or people at the time Final Fantasy 14 was released, expected to have freedom of customization, like have lots of options to be able to control things like eye shapes, eye size, um, gender, obviously, and to have, you know, multiple options for their preferred gender and race. But it was just something lacking in Final Fantasy 14 1.0. And some people voiced their displeasure about that. But that wasn't the only thing, though. The other thing was that the servers themselves and the graphical engine was not as wonderful as it could be. And the reason for this is that they were taking an engine which they had borrowed from another previous game and decided to, I guess, make it work somehow for a mass multiplayer online game. And it just wasn't able to handle all the stress of like so many people wanting to play the game together and play it with friends, family, etc. And so they ended up not being quite able to provide as much of what the players really wanted to see and what they wanted to feel and experience with Final Fantasy. And because of the instability, it would often lead to the servers crashing a lot, or players would be DCing constantly, and then they'd have to log back in, and they'd be in a ridiculously long queue line. And then sometimes the game would just stop working altogether, and they wouldn't even be able to like play at all or leave an area. They'd be stuck in an area. Like, be glitches everywhere. Oh man, it was just a disaster. And people memed on that too. They laughed about it, had their laughs. But then, you know, not everyone was having a good time. The majority of people weren't. And so they, you know, they would write complaints to Square Enix. They'd go talk to gaming journalism and tell them, like, as a Final Fantasy, this game feels kind of weak. It leaves kind of a bitter and sour taste on the mouth, on the tongue. And so they would give it really poor ratings of like a 4 out of 10 or 3.5 out of 10. Some, if they were feeling generous, might have put a 5. Like, it's no joke. The 1.0 of Final Fantasy XIV was just getting that bad. So finally, enough people decided they had enough, so they just stopped subscribing. They stopped logging in. And there's only the few, loyalists, diehards, whatever you want to call them, whales, fanboys, fangirls, whatever you wish to call them. They were the only ones left behind to hold the fort, keep the game. In fact, funnily enough, when Square Enix came out and said, as a public apology, that they didn't mean for things to turn out as bad as they did, and that they're gonna try and make it up to the fan base, the players, and they gave the previous director and producer the boot. That's putting it nicely, by the way. I'm sure the company CEO or head of the company was probably not very happy about this at all, because they had lost a lot of revenue from Final Fantasy XIV's 1.0 disaster, and all the surfacing bad reviews and everything. So they ended up giving the previous director and producers the boot, though they kept the director on 1.0 when the legendary man himself, the top dog who comes in to rescue Final Fantasy XIV, Naoki Yoshida himself, Warrior of Light, and the new producer came over, and he's like, okay, I've never worked on an MMO before, but I know what an MMO is and what it incorporates and what they need to be successful. But he said, I'm going to need some help with this, though, is when he told his development staff and team on Final Fantasy XIV. Sorry, guys, I'm just going to gargle a bit of water here. My throat's kind of getting a little raspy. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit better. Almost, anyway. Okay. Hopefully you guys can still hear me. One more little interruption here, sorry. Just want to make sure we're still coherent here. Just want to make sure. Okay, there we go. Looks like we are still live and coherent. That's good. Very good. Alright, so continuing on. So they gave Naoki Yoshida the position, and he discussed with his dev team. Like I said, he made a public apology on Square Enix's behalf to the players And after he finished 1.0, he bowed his head and then he had tears and everything. He's like, please forgive us for our negligence. Please give us another chance. And we will make it up to you guys. We will make sure that you have the game that you praise and adore, the game that you supported, and a game that we both appreciate, essentially. And so Naoki Yoshida took over. He finished 1.0. And that maybe brought in like a few players back. Some did decide to come back. You're like, okay, you know what? Maybe this guy knows what he's doing. So I'll give him a chance. And so some players came back, and they're, like I said, they joined in with the diehards, the whales, whatever you want to call them, the whales, the fanboys, fangirls. Came back and joined them. They finished 1.0. And then came the announcement, hey, you know, we hope that you enjoyed your Final Fantasy XIV experience and everything. We really appreciated all your love and support. But we're going to shut down the servers, shut down the service for Final Fantasy XIV for a time. Key wording there, for a time. While we introduce you to a Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. And so a lot of people were shocked, and they were also ecstatic to hear this news. They're like, wow. So does that mean we're getting like a complete like revamp of this game? Is it actually going to be good for once? And so they were all super hyped and everything, and they just like, you know, like, yeah, this is awesome, you guys. You know, let's give it a chance. Let's give them a try, okay? And so they finished 1.0 with a bang, quite literally a big, huge bang. This is, I don't know, kind of spoilery-ish. I mean, kind of not. I mean, if you were there, you were there. You know what happened, and even in the current Final Fantasy XIV, it's not really something that's brought up in the story as much. It's mentioned here and there, and then there's a certain side quest, wink wink, that you can do if you really want to know, like the full detail of what went down, what happened. Well, maybe not the full details, but you'll get the general idea, basically. But essentially, yeah, they ended the Final Fantasy world of 1.0. They sent a literal ball of fire down to just wipe out everything. So if that's not what happened, rest assured, we are still in the same Final Fantasy world. It's not like it's been like erased and then remade or what have you. It's still the same Final Fantasy XIV we know and love, but basically it was, I guess you could say, a type of extinction event where a lot of stuff went down. Not all of it good, but it happened. And then came the Realm Reborn in its place. And this is where it gets really special and heartwarming, kind of a tearjerker for me, because I had stopped playing 1.0 because my friend no longer, he no longer kept the game. I think he hawked it or something, or something. Oh man, so I didn't have my character anymore to fiddle around with on 1.0. So, oh well, It happens. But yeah. A Realm Reborn I got to jump into like right very early um, during its time of being released. And wow, it was fantastic. Now, I want to particularly talk about Realm Reborn for a minute or two here for a moment. Because a lot of people like to give a Realm Reborn backlash and say, oh, it's so dull, it's so uninteresting, it's so boring. Why do I have to do all this stuff in a Realm Reborn? It's just not fun and whatnot. And I'll say to you, don't be ignorant. Don't take things for granted, and don't be ignorant. Because A Realm Reborn was and still is the very pinnacle and height of when Final Fantasy XIV was at its very, very best. Like, I'm not even kidding you. It frustrates me to see when I hear people say, "Oh, that's Realm Reborn's kind of shit," it sucks. It's not fun at all, and I'm just like, you're being completely ignorant here, you know. You are, because you have to really understand and really be able to look back at what Final Fantasy 1.0 was, and then look at what they came out from that with A Realm Reborn to fully appreciate and understand that A Realm Reborn was and is 14 when it was at its best point. Not to discredit or say that other expansions that came after were better or worse, because in my opinion, Heavensward was fantastic. It was the first expansion, if you don't count A Realm Reborn tacked on from 1.0. It was technically the first expansion for most Final Fantasy XIV's players, if not all of them. And it was a fantastic expansion. It was. Great story, great music, great content. It was just overall fun. And Stormblood was kind of good. I mean, I enjoyed parts of it, not everything I enjoyed, but I enjoyed Stormblood in some regards. But for the majority, Stormblood was also kind of flawed like 1.0, but not to the extent of 1.0 really. But then comes Shadowbringers, and that restored some more of my faith in the developers, and they know what they're doing. They are working hard. They hear our feedback. They're listening. So that Shadowbringers made up for some of the disappointment and failure that Stormblood was, and I will always praise Shadowbringers. Like, I don't have very much negative to say about Shadowbringers, other than the fact that, you know, they took away the job quest, which I feel really made jobs feel special and unique, story-wise. Whereas now, you're just some dude. You're just some dude, you show up, and they're like, oh, well, you're some great warrior. You can handle anything, right? Okay, well, I need your help. That's it. So that was disappointing to me in Shadowbringers. Then the fact that, they were once again from, like, at least it felt a little bit to me that they didn't feel like they learned anything from Stormblood, but they were repeating gameplay content, What I mean by gameplay content, content that you engage yourself into, battle content, dungeons, raids, trials, little map things. They've just completely repeated them. They didn't offer really anything new or unique battle wise for us to really even just dig into. They're just like, okay, here's your raids, here's your dungeons, here's your trials. Go at it, have fun. Like, that much I was disappointed in. I had hoped that they would have done more battle wise, but they didn't. So, and Walker might prove me wrong. They might do some more stuff, and they said they're going to on the PvP aspect side of things. They didn't say much about PvE other than that they're scaling back on PvE content just a little bit to make things, I guess, more challenging. I don't really understand the whole argument or reason behind it. They're just scaling back for whatever reason, which is fine. It's if the people aren't happy about it, they'll tell them and they'll listen. So, and that's one of the important things to notice about what you guys will notice. You guys, as the newer players, will notice is that this dev team does in fact listen to your voice, whether or not they believe in everything you say. They'll still give you a fair hearing so that they understand where the player base is, where they stand, and how they'll continue to go in directions forward. And sometimes, even this dev team will even go above and beyond, and they'll push themselves even in harsh conditions such as this pandemic nonsense going on. They'll still even push just to get people more of what they want to see in Final Fantasy XIV, more of what they love. And that's really important that you understand as well in Final Fantasy XIV as a new player, is that the developers are pouring their very hearts and soul into the game. So, if there's for whatever reason, any backdraw or maybe something flawed, then it's just because of strict scheduling and more of the corporate side of things than it is the developers themselves. The developers themselves do work tooth and nail and work hard, really hard, to produce content for Final Fantasy XIV. So I will give them props for that and applaud them for doing such a thing. Even in the previous video I made, previous discussion, I made sure I gave my words and credit to, the music producer of Final Fantasy XIV, Masayoshi Soken, student of the ever infamous Square Enix musician and Meister. He was a student of that great personage, whose name I'm just drawing a blank on for a minute. I should know it, but yeah, Soken was his student, and Soken was on his deathbed, literally on his deathbed, you guys. He was literally dying from cancer. And he still wanted to work on Final Fantasy XIV. He still wanted to get the music and the sound done and sent off so that we could have the ending of Shadowbringers and have the beginning of Endwalker. So that tells you a lot about the love and care that the devs pour into this game. So anyway, moving on. Moving back to Realm Reborn. Like I said, don't think too negatively on Realm Reborn because it was a really, really great time for Final Fantasy XIV. The community was great, fantastic. They helped each other out. They pushed each other up. They helped you get your goals, meet your goals, and fulfill your dreams in Final Fantasy XIV. Sometimes they would be bitter towards each other, but you know, their bitterness was in a realm of their bitterness compared to now, I should say. Their bitterness compared to now was more like, you know, a fighting with a sibling. Yeah, you get mad, you fight, but then you guys just eventually make up and get over it eventually. So that's what the community was like in A Realm Reborn, and that's the community that I respected the most. But unfortunately, as I outlined in my other video, I don't want to, you know, keep parroting or sound like a broken record here. So I would refer, if you're curious to know about that, then please refer to my other video on the channel about all that stuff. But I like the community in The Realm Reborn, and the game was a lot different from other MMOs that I've tried out and played. The visuals were pretty, you know, they were pretty beautiful. Music had its charms, and it was just a vast open world that I really enjoyed immersing myself into in A Realm Reborn. And I got to enjoy it with others quite a bit. At least up until mid Stormblood. That's when, like I said, things started to change a little bit. Not for the best, unfortunately. But that's just what happens with online games. They typically will have their heights of success and heights of glory, if you will. But then as time passes and they become more popular or more received, it just kind of invites sort of bad actors, bad voices that bring in lots of toxicity and vitriol, and lots of much hate into the game, which is very sad and very unfortunate. And developers really can't do too much about that unless it's something that happens inside the game. Then they can punish those people that are being so negative and ruining the experience for players. But outside the game, there's not really a whole much they can do if, you know, some of these bad actors and bad influences, like gang up in mobs and go after someone's Twitter account, Facebook, or whatever it is. You know, they can't really do much on that front. And that's where the player themselves has to just kind of take responsibility and inform proper authorities or whoever's in charge of those sort of places that they use to share their Final Fantasy XIV experience in. But why I praise A Realm Reborn even more so is that not just because of the community we had, but also because of, the content. It was all new. It was all fresh. Like the only things that they brought back from A Realm Reborn was just the typical side questing, the class questing, and some of the playable races. And they improved upon these playable races, by the way, in A Realm Reborn. And they even added the missing variants to these races. Did you know, before A Realm Reborn, there was no male Mikotos? Big gasp, I know. Final Fantasy without cat boys? Monstrous! How dare they? That's what a lot of people will say, but it's true. There were no cat boys. There were no female Rogadin. I don't think there were even male Lalafell, actually, or something like that. I remember somewhere saying like they didn't have like female or male Lalafell for whatever reason. They definitely didn't have female Rogadin though, or the cat boys. So they added on to that in A Realm Reborn. They also added 3 new jobs in A Realm Reborn. Yes, that's right. You're hearing me right. I said 3 more jobs. 3 new more jobs. That being Scholar, Summoner, and Ninja. But all 3 of them were pretty great and fun jobs to play. Definitely a lot of Final Fantasy elements to them. And that's another thing that makes Final Fantasy XIV a Final Fantasy game, is just the core elements that are introduced with the playable jobs. They all bespeak names to the Final Fantasy genre as a whole. So we got that. 3 new jobs. They barely borrowed anything from 1.0. Very few things. So a lot of the stuff they brought on Realm Reborn was completely fresh and new, as it should be. That's how any update that they bring to the game should feel like. It should feel like it's fresh, unique, new. You've never tried it before. It's just something you completely get to experience for the first time, and you've never experienced this before. That's how expansions in particular should be and feel like. But regrettably for Final Fantasy XIV's history and track record, that hasn't been the case since A Realm Reborn. Everything's just kind of being recycled, reused, rehashed, repainted, and it's really unfortunate. And I don't really know why their corporate decided to do this. Like I said, it's not the developers' faults at all why this is that way. It's just that it's all that they can feasibly manage and do with the schedules that they have, and the corporate looming over their heads, as well as the mounting pressure from the player base and fan base. So with all that going on, they can't really say or make promises they can't keep. But they'll damn sure try to keep promises, trust me. They will damn try. They've proved that they will keep promises if they can. And they have. Like after the whole Ronso and or Rothgar, whatever you wish to call them, and the Vieira, the bunny-eared race people, after that whole debacle, they saw how vocal the community was and split about that topic, that they're like, you know what, perhaps we should give them, you know, that other option that that they're dying to have, you know. And so they did. They added the male variant of the Vieira, and then they haven't stated when they'll add the female Ronso or Rothgar, whichever name you prefer to refer to them as. And they've also, but they've said that they are working on it here and there to make sure that it's presentable, it works, and people will be able to enjoy that option. But oh, anyway, sorry, I keep dancing between topics. You know, there's just so much I want to make sure that you new players are aware of, and that you understand when you come into Final Fantasy XIV, so that you'll really be able to appreciate Final Fantasy XIV for what it is and what it was. So anyway, back to Realm Reborn. You know, they had the new jobs, the content that was all fresh. Like, they didn't have this in 1.0. And it was just fantastic. It really was. A Realm Reborn, I will always treasure those memories. And I really wish you new players got to experience that same feeling as well. I mean, some of you probably still do. Some of you, even now that are new players, probably still do experience some of that profoundness of, oh, hey, you know, this is actually pretty new. This is interesting. I kind of like it, yeah. You know, you get those moments like that when you first jump into 14, and that's great. That's really, really great. I'm glad for that. I'm glad that you feel that same way that I did before. So, okay, we talked about A Realm Reborn. I think I'm done with my thoughts on that now. But anyway, let's move on. I want to speak to you in regards of the community now, because we briefly touched upon how it was in A Realm Reborn before and in 1.0. So now, and like I said, because of how the community is started to become now versus what it was then, is becoming pretty much similar to any other online game. So if you're someone who's familiar with online gaming, then you'll know what that means when I say that. Is that it's really no different from any other community out there. It's not. And anyone who's out there telling you guys, they're telling you guys that, oh no, this is the fantastic community ever. There's always helpful people coming in. They're always helping. They're straight up lying to you. Lying through their damn teeth. Because that's not the truth of it. Maybe it was back, years ago when The Realm Reborn was fresh, when it was new, when I played it and everything. It was like that, maybe, sure. But now, right now, no, it's really not that way anymore. It's grown in toxic behaviors and unacceptable behaviors. And there's a lot of it. It's not just a few small select groups. There's a lot of it, and it spreads. It's spreading like a virus to lots of players in 14, regrettably. And I feel sorry for those people that have succumbed to this influence. I really do. I'm sorry for you succumbing to such toxicity and bad behavior. And I hope that maybe you'll snap back to your senses eventually. And if you don't, well, oh well. It was nice knowing you. Because I'm not sticking around, and I know quite a few others who are not also going to stick around because of all these bad attitudes and bad behaviors that are being promoted, by the way, by bad actors, bad influencers. Like I said, I've outlined this all in my other discussion, so if you really must know what all that entails, please refer to the other video. And no, I'm not saying that to get views either. I'm just letting you know so that I'm not constantly repeating myself here. And that every video that I'm making feels like the same. So, if you want to know, just refer to that video before this one. But anyway, like I'm saying, this community of Final Fantasy XIV is, as it is right now, it's no different from any other MMO online community that's out there. It's pretty much the same thing. Same amount of toxicity, same amount of foul play, horseplay, but there's also maybe a portion or portions, smaller portions that are pretty decent people. They're decent players to play with. They'll offer tips and advice for you, and they'll help you out if you're struggling a little bit, or if you need a little bit of help or hand holding. They'll help you out. But just regrettably right now, they're just so very small in number, and it's pretty sad. It's pretty sad, I have to say. So I'm telling you this, you newer players, just as a heads up, as a warning, so that you're not being naive about it when you're approached in game by someone who may seemingly seem okay and nice at first, but then later you come to find out, oh, he just really said that, didn't he? He just said that all players who don't parse or at this or don't play at his level are garbage. He just said that, didn't he? And he wasn't even joking about it, was he? And some people will take that too. They'll think, oh, that's just an inside joke. Oh, he didn't really mean that. He's just playing, messing around with you. No. I'll tell you right now, no. Some people are actually that toxic in behavior, that bad in behavior in Final Fantasy XIV. Some of them will diss you for the smallest of error, or they'll diss you for looking a certain way, like your character looking a certain way. These people do exist in the Final Fantasy community, you guys. I'm not joking at all. I'm being 100% truthful with you. All throughout this whole video, I've been telling you nothing but the straight truth and facts as I have come to know them, and as many other players who've played just as long as I have know them. And for those players like me who have played as long and they're still denying the facts and the truth, well, I'm going to have to drop a foul word here, but fuck them. They're part of the problem. And maybe it's time that they need to go. So, that's how I feel about these bad people in the community, is that they're not joking around, they're not playing around, they're not horse playing, they're actually that bad. So be mindful, you guys, of that aspect. Don't be completely naive. Be mindful, be vigilant, and be aware. And that's what I'm trying to do here with this video, is help you be more aware and go into the game with more knowledge that you may not have had before, but now you do. And you'll be thankful for it later down the line. Sometime you'll be thankful for all this information that I've just outlined and given to you. You'll be quite thankful that you did have this information. Now anyway, other than those dire messages and warnings, let's get into some more meat and bones of Final Fantasy XIV that you may need to know as a new player, and that's that this game is a Final Fantasy game, like I've outlined in the very beginning of this video. So that means it's at its core, very story driven. So everything and progress that you will make through the game, it will require that you do story content. Now, some might not like that. They might say, oh, that's just gating. I don't want to play their dumb story. I don't want to listen to so-and-so NPC's problems. I don't care. I just want to get to the raids stuff. I want to get to the end game Savage Ultimates. And that's fine, you know. You have your style of gameplay and you have your view of what you think is fun to do. But this game is story driven. So like it or not, you're going to have to progress through the story if you want to get to that stuff that you like having so much fun with. So that will always be a requirement as long as this game holds the title and name Final Fantasy XIV. So bear that in mind when you're jumping in to Final Fantasy XIV. Is that this game is very story heavy, and it is required that you do some story in order for you to progress and get to the very end game sort of styled content. Now, aside from that, story driven and community aspects and the history that we've went over of Final Fantasy XIV, I also want you new players to never give up. It may seem daunting and a really long journey, and it is. It's several hundred hours of worth of content for you to ingest for the story alone, plus all the other things that you may decide to do: glamour farming, mount farming, PvP, um, crafting, gathering, all that stuff. It is a lot of hours to kind of invest in, but that's okay though. It's perfectly fine because it just means that you'll never run out of things to do when you're playing 14 until you've completed every single thing. And there are players out there in Final Fantasy 14's community that are like that. They like to complete everything, get every achievement, every mount that they possibly can. And that's hours and hours of content that they ingested to get to that. So you are getting, your money's worth when you pay for the subscription model. And that's the other thing important to know, is that this isn't a free to play game like some other games are that are MMOs. This is a subscription model MMO, so you have to pay monthly by monthly subscription, or they even give you the option to pay for 6 months in advance. So you'll have 6 months stretched out of content. Of course, their development cycle, how they handle content, they push a major big patch out every 3 to 4 months, and then within those 3 to 4 months they push out little bits of sub content, side content to do until the major update comes, and then they bring out more of the fleshed out content, basically. There is a cash shop in Final Fantasy 14, but it isn't entirely pay to win or pay to whatever. It does have, however, skipping or jumping, whatever potions you wish to refer to them as, basically meaning you'll be able to be close to max level when you start the game, if that's the route you choose, which is fine. That's your decision, but it really kind of cheapens a little bit of going through the game and actually being able to grasp everything fully and invest yourself into it. You're just going to find yourself becoming bored because you're already at the highest level, so you don't really have that motivation to want to do everything. And that's brings us to the other thing, is that you can actually even skip entire expansions worth of content if you chose to. You can always go back to it, of course, if you want to, but by then, it's going to feel more like a task and more like a chore to do that than for it to actually be something that's a rewarding and well-earned, well-deserved content that you got versus that. So that's the one negative side on the cash shop. But other than that, most of the cash shop items are all completely cosmetics. You can get additional costumes for your character. You can get a thing that will allow you to re-edit your character or change their race or gender. Like if you tried out at one race to start, and then you decided later, you know what, I'm not actually that happy playing as this particular character or this race, so I'm going to change it. So there you go, you have that option. But also, you don't even have to buy this character redo potion. They actually give you a few free. If you've subscribed to the game for a long time, you'll get like 2 free bottles of the stuff. And then if you do the main story quests up to like where you get I think a grand company now, where you get yourself into a grand company, which is basically you know, a military outfit in the 3 major city states of the game. When you get to that point, they'll give you a free bottle of the stuff. They call it Fantasia. So if you don't feel like paying for that, well, don't have to pay for that. You'll get one automatically in game free. And there's few mounts, few weapon skins that you can buy in the cash shop. But that's really it. Aside from that, most other things you pretty much get in game. You can get lots of decent looking gear in the game, lots of decent mounts. You have even hairstyles that you can get obtained in game, different and new hairstyles. And yeah, you can. Another thing, I guess this is an important thing for quite a lot of players, but there is housing in Final Fantasy XIV, but I have to warn you so you don't get disappointed about that. Don't set your expectations so high, because you'll be disappointed. But with housing, it's very limited. Only the players who have enough gil, which is the in-game currency, one of the in-game currencies that you earn. Only players with enough amount of that accumulated can afford to have one, and even then you'll still have to shell out more gil to either craft or buy furniture and stuff like you see around behind my character here. You'll have to shell out gil for that as well. And it's just limited in supply. And not to mention, on the part of it being limited, you also can't just leave it sitting and be like, okay, well, I have my place, my house, so I'm just gonna go off and play content, hang out with friends or whatever, and I'll go to my house when I feel like going there. Well, no, you won't, because you have to step foot into your place like every 30 days or so, or else you lose it. And then you can't buy it back either, because it goes to the free market, and there's a long line. People still waiting for a house, and they're gonna be there. Clicking on the placard. See, that's how you buy houses in 14. Is you have to go up to a placard that's available and see if you can purchase it. And when you lose a house, it goes back to that free market, and then it goes on a timer from when it was released. And you're just gonna have to sit there and pray to whatever merciful gods you keep, or merciful God you keep, that you get your house back if you lost it.
because there's going to be a swarm, a hive of people that really want a house badly, so badly that you're going to not have a good time with housing in Final Fantasy XIV. Other than if you opt into the other additional option they have, which is buying a room that's private for yourself, either through apartment complex or through your own free company group. If you decided to join a group of friends or a group of people in a free company group, then you have the side option of purchasing a private room which you can decorate and design to your heart's content, and you'll never lose that one. At least not the apartment one, but the free company house. Like if there's like drama in the free company between yourself and free company people in charge, they can kick you and you'll lose your room. Or if just nobody uses the free company house like at all, then and they lose the house, then you automatically will use that room too. So the apartment is probably the way to go if you just want your own private space to be in and just decorate how you like and whatnot. But unfortunately, that means you won't have a yard to sit out in and decorate either, and you can still have friends come and visit and stuff, but like features that a house has, you won't actually be able to have access to. So it's regrettable, but the dev team has acknowledged that their current housing system is broken. It doesn't work. It's just a mess. And they've said that they're looking into alternatives to handle the situation. Because so far they know that just adding more house plots isn't really going to fix the problem as a whole. So they're trying to think of ways that they might be able to adjust it in the future. Other than that, if you're going to play as the Vieira or the Ronso race, keep in mind there is a lot of hairstyles you will not be able to access to, and hats and helmets you won't be a lot of hats and helmets you won't be able to wear or have access to. You'll still be able to equip them, but they won't display because the developers they haven't been able to code it in to make it work without it looking like horrible, clippy, kind of like um, stuff. So just be mindful of that if you decide to play as Ronso or Hrothgar and Vieira races. Just keep that in mind that their hairstyle options and their hats and helmet options are very restricted at the moment. Other than that, all I can really say left is, enjoy yourself, you know, play as much of the game as you possibly can or be able to. Pick up a few friends maybe along the way, or ask some friends to join, because it is it's a really long journey. It is. There's no exaggeration about that. Final Fantasy XIV is a long journey. And I hope that a lot of you guys who are new will take this wisdom, this knowledge I've shared with you, and hopefully it helps you a lot. Hopefully it helped you gain understanding, gain clarity, you know, of what this game is, what it means, what it's all about, and you'll be able to fully appreciate the game as it is and understand that, it is an MMO like any other MMO. It's really, you guys, it's really not at the very top like a lot of people would say it is. Don't cave into all the um, eccentric and grossly exaggerated praise, because it's really a naive way of thinking, and it sends really a bad message as well to other games and people that love other games too. It sends a bad message, and in fact that's one of the things going on right now within the Final Fantasy XIV community, is that the people keep sending a bad message to World of Warcraft, and it's just unacceptable behavior, and it needs to stop. But yeah, my final thoughts to you newer players is play the game, play as much of it as you can, all the way up to the end if possible. Try everything, and I do mean try everything. Crafting, try gathering, try multiple jobs. You can have um, all the jobs that are playable on one single character. You don't have to make another character just to roll a different job. You can play all of them on a single job, or a single character, sorry, not a single job. And the devs, and like I said, throw a few kind words to the devs every now and then. They really appreciate it. It really motivates them and helps their days go by better. When they're designing 14, and they're actually. This is the funny thing about the development team that I heard over the years, and that's that Naoki Yoshida actually he encourages and tells his development team to play Final Fantasy XIV, not just design it. It's a crazy thought, I know. They made this game, right? So they already know what everything is. So how are they supposed to really enjoy when they already know everything, how it is and stuff? And well, they just do it just because, because they it helps them connect with the players. It helps them understand, what the players are talking about when they send in feedback about problems that are happening within game. It helps them connect that way, and they're like, oh, duh, that's right. This guy is making sense. He's not just saying critical things just to be negative, or spout nonsense. He actually has sense. We played the game too, and we found that, yeah, that's actually true. It's there. So yeah, let's go patch that later. Yeah, so yeah, the dev team, like I said, throw them a few words of praise here and there. It really helps them out. And try not to struggle too hard in content. It's always there for you to try and go back to and everything like that. But you know, just you guys have fun with Final Fantasy XIV. Enjoy everything that you can about it, and um, yeah, I'm not sure what else more I need to cover here. And yeah, you guys, thank you for hearing my message. Thanks for sticking around to watch. I saw a few comments pop in here. I'll read those a little bit later on, so thank you. And yeah, I hope you new players come in with newfound knowledge and that you'll actually understand now, have a better understanding now of what Final Fantasy is, what Final Fantasy XIV is, and how it's sort of evolved and changed over the years that it's been up in service. So thank you for watching, and I hope you guys have a good journey. I may not be there with you on that journey. I've decided in my mind that I'm going to quit. I've been here long enough, and I don't really agree with the evolution of Final Fantasy XIV, how it's evolved up to this point. And some people will disagree with that, and that's okay. They won't have to listen to me as much because I'm leaving, so goody goody for them. But there's nothing lost for me on that front. I enjoyed Final Fantasy XIV a lot. It was my bread and butter, my soul. I've met a lot of fantastic and really wonderful friends and people in Final Fantasy XIV. So it wasn't all glum and bad for me as it was, as it is, I should say, for me now. But like I said, you can refer to my other video for my full entire breakdown and thoughts of why I'm leaving Final Fantasy XIV, and why I feel like this message is sort of a beacon for newer players that I hope will be able to get some newfound knowledge, be able to go into 14 to know exactly what they're getting into. There's no surprises at all. They know what to expect, and they'll just be able to fully appreciate the game for what it is and for what it was. And I'll close the video off here. I appreciate you all for being here, my subscribers especially, and followers. I appreciate you all. I will be finding new games in the future to share with you that I enjoy. One in particular, as I mentioned in the other video, is called Blue Protocol. It's another MMO. It will be free to play, which a lot of people are turned off by that word, free to play. But It is a game that's shaping up to be something really fun. I hope it's successful. If not, that's okay too. I will share my thoughts on why it's not successful and what flaws it had too if it doesn't turn out well. So, again, Amadeus Aeon here, and thank you all very much for being here and watching.